My name is Jack Morrison, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 1988. I was a park ranger at Crater Lake National Park, and trust me, I wish I could forget everything that occurred during those terrifying weeks. But some things just stick with you, no matter how hard you try to shake them off. I'd been working at Crater Lake for about 5 years then. You know the place? It's this stunning blue lake in Oregon, sitting right in the middle of an ancient volcano. Most days, I loved my job, helping visitors, patrolling the trails, and watching the sun rise over what I thought was the most beautiful lake in the world. Boy, was I wrong about it just being a lake? My partner was Sarah Chen, probably the smartest ranger I'd ever worked with. She knew everything about the park's geology and could spot a troubled hiker from a mile away. We made a great team, or at least we did until everything went sideways. It all started when the Miller's RV was found abandoned near Cleetwood Cove. Nothing too unusual about that at first. Sometimes tourists leave their vehicles for a bit while hiking. But then we found their dinner still warm on the table inside, their phones, wallets, everything just left behind, like they had vanished into thin air. I remember standing there, looking at their half-eaten sandwiches, when the first chill ran down my spine. Something felt wrong. Really wrong. And that was just the beginning. Within a week, 2 more RVs turned up empty. Same story. Personal belongings untouched. No signs of struggle, just empty. Like the people had been plucked right out of their lives. If I had known then what I know now about what lives in those deep, dark waters, well, maybe I could have saved more people. Maybe I could have saved Sarah. But let me start from the beginning, and I'll tell you exactly what happened during those nightmare weeks at Crater Lake. The first weird thing I noticed, besides the empty RVs, was the sounds. You see, I'd worked night shifts at Crater Lake for years, and I knew all the normal noises, the wind in the trees, the occasional owl, maybe some distant coyotes. But this was different. It started on a Tuesday night. I was doing my usual patrol around the lake's rim when I heard it, a deep, rumbling sound coming from the water. At first, I thought maybe it was just the wind playing tricks, but then Sarah heard it too. "Jack," she whispered, shining her flashlight over the lake's surface. "I've never heard anything like that before." The sound was like, well, imagine someone dragging heavy furniture across a wooden floor, but underwater. And it seemed to move around the lake, never staying in one spot too long. The next day, I decided to check out the old park records, hoping to find something, anything, that might explain what was going on. That's when I found the yellowed folder marked Local Tribal Warnings. Inside were letters from Native American elders, dating back to the 1920s, warning the Park Service about the lake. "The waters hold ancient spirits," one letter said. "They take the form of those they catch. Do not trust what you see near the deep waters after dark." I remember laughing it off at first. I mean, come on, shape-shifting spirits. But then I saw Sarah talking to a tourist near the lake one evening. Nothing strange about that, except I had just left Sarah back at the ranger station, filing reports. When I radioed her, she answered from the station. "I'm still here, Jack. What do you mean you can see me?" I looked back at the spot where Sarah had been talking to the tourist. They were both gone. Just gone. That night, the sounds from the lake got louder, and as I stood at the rim, my flashlight beam caught something in the water, a cave entrance I'd never seen before, partly hidden by rocks. It shouldn't have been there. I'd been past that spot hundreds of times. But the worst part? For just a second, I saw lights down there, deep under the water. Like a city's streetlights, twinkling in the depths where no lights should ever be. I knew right then that everything was about to change. I just didn't know how much. The next morning, I tried telling my boss about what I'd seen, but he just looked at me like I was crazy. Can't blame him. I mean, underwater lights and mysterious caves. It did sound pretty out there. But things got worse that afternoon. I was checking on my RV. Yeah, I lived in one near the ranger station, when something really freaky happened. I opened the door and water just poured out. Not a little water, but gallons of it. like someone had filled the whole RV up to the ceiling. And here's the weird part. It wasn't normal water. It was lake water, complete with that special blue color Crater Lake is famous for. "Sarah!" I called out. "Come, look at this!" She came running, but by the time she got there, the water was gone. Just gone. Not even a wet spot on the floor. Like it never happened. "Jack," Sarah said, looking worried, "maybe you should take a break. You've been working too hard." But I knew what I saw. And Sarah, well, she wasn't acting like herself anymore. She kept staring at the lake for long periods, and sometimes I'd catch her whispering to herself in a language I didn't understand. That evening, 3 more rangers showed up from other parks, saying they were sent to help with the missing RV cases. But something was off about them too. Their movements were stiff, like they were wearing clothes that didn't quite fit. And their eyes looked too dark, too empty. I was in the break room when I overheard them talking. One of them said, "The city awakens. Soon they will all see." Their voices sounded weird, like they were talking underwater. Later that night, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. I was standing by the lake when this thing came out of the water. At first, it looked like a person, but then it changed. Its skin rippled like the lake's surface, and for a second, I saw my own face looking back at me. Then it smiled, the kind of smile that makes your blood freeze, and dove back into the water. I ran back to the station and locked myself in. But sitting there in the dark, I could hear that deep rumbling sound again. And this time, it sounded like words. "Come see your future, Jack Morrison. Come see how you die." I knew I had to do something. People were still disappearing, and whatever was in that lake was getting stronger. But first, I needed to find out what happened to the real Sarah. Because the person walking around with her face, that wasn't my partner anymore. I waited until dawn to make my move. I figured whatever was out there might be weaker in daylight. At least, that's what I hoped. I packed my gear, waterproof flashlights, rope, and my diving equipment. After 5 years as a ranger, I knew Crater Lake's waters pretty well, but I'd never gone near that new cave I'd spotted. Just as I was about to head out, the fake Sarah walked in. She looked exactly like my partner, but her movements were all wrong, like someone trying to copy a dance they'd only seen once. "Going somewhere, Jack?" she asked, smiling that not quite right smile. "Just routine patrol," I lied, trying to act normal. "The water is nice today," she said, still smiling. "Perfect for swimming. Why don't we both go?" A shiver ran down my spine. The way she said it, it wasn't a suggestion. It was a threat. I made a run for it, sprinting toward Cleetwood Cove, the only safe place to enter the lake. Behind me, I heard her laughing, but it sounded like bubbling water. When I reached the cove, I saw them, 5 copies of myself, all standing at the water's edge. They turned to look at me, moving in perfect sync. It was like looking at mirrors, except each one had those same dark, empty eyes. "Join us," they said together. "See what we've built." Then the water began to glow. Not just in one spot, but everywhere. Through the crystal-clear lake, I could see it, a city under the water, with buildings made of some strange, shimmering material. Streets and towers stretched out into the darkness, lit by an eerie blue light. That's when I realized Crater Lake wasn't just a lake. It was a lid, keeping something ancient trapped underneath. And now that something was trying to get out, one of my doubles stepped forward. "We can show you everything, Jack. How you die, how everyone dies. The water knows all futures." I knew I had only one choice. I had to go down there. The real Sarah might still be alive somewhere in that underwater city. And whatever these things were, they had to be stopped before more people disappeared. I put on my diving gear, trying to keep my hands from shaking. The copies of me just watched, still smiling those horrible smiles. As I stepped into the water, I heard that deep rumbling voice again. "Welcome home, Jack Morrison." The last thing I saw before diving under was the fake Sarah arriving at the cove, her form rippling like water in the morning sun. What I found under those waters, well, That's the part of the story that still keeps me awake at night. The water was colder than I'd ever felt it, even with my diving gear on. As I went deeper, those underwater lights got brighter. The city below looked like something from a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Buildings made of some strange black stone stretched up from the lake bottom, covered in symbols that seemed to move when I looked at them. I saw movement everywhere, shapes that looked like people swimming between the buildings. Some had faces I recognized, the missing tourists, other rangers, and dozens of Sarahs and Jacks. They all moved like they were part of some creepy underwater dance. My dive computer started going crazy, showing impossible depths. That's when I saw it, the real source of all this. In the center of the city stood a massive temple, and inside it was, well, the closest I can call it is a skinwalker, but it wasn't like any legend I'd ever heard of. It was huge, its body constantly changing like flowing water. One second it looked human, the next like something that should never exist. And it was creating them, all those copies, pulling them out of itself like a kid making shapes with clay. Then I saw her, the real Sarah, frozen in some kind of bubble near the temple. She was alive but sleeping, like all the other real people I could see trapped in similar bubbles. The copies were just puppets, meant to lure more people into the lake. I swam closer to Sarah's bubble, but suddenly found myself surrounded by my duplicates. Underwater, they moved perfectly, like they were born there. One of them spoke, and I could hear it clearly despite being underwater. "This is our true home, Jack. Soon, we'll have enough copies to walk on land permanently. The whole world will become like the lake." That's when I noticed something about the temple. There were huge, ancient gates at its base. Gates that were slowly opening wider each minute. If they opened completely, whatever was inside wouldn't be trapped in the lake anymore. I had to make a terrible choice. Sarah was right there, just out of reach. But if I didn't stop those gates from opening, whatever this thing was would spread beyond Crater Lake. Near the temple, I spotted what looked like an old control room, probably built by the same ancient people who'd trapped this thing here in the first place. Inside, I could see a large lever marked with warning symbols. I knew what I had to do, but making the choice, that was the hardest part of all. My air was running low, and my hands were shaking as I swam toward that control room. The duplicates tried to grab me, but years of swimming in this lake had made me strong. I dodged between them, pushing through the cold water as fast as I could. Inside the control room, everything was covered in a weird, glowing slime. The lever I'd seen was huge, like something from an old factory. Above it was a drawing that showed the temple being sealed by rock and water. I looked back at Sarah one last time. She was still floating there, peaceful in her bubble, not knowing what was happening. "I'm sorry," I whispered through my breathing mask. Just as I grabbed the lever, the skinwalker noticed what I was doing. It rushed toward me, bigger than a house now, its watery body changing shapes faster than I could follow. Behind it, all my duplicates swam toward me too, their faces twisted in anger. I pulled the lever with all my strength. The whole city started shaking. Rocks began falling from above. The lake walls were caving in. The ancient builders had made it so the whole cave system could be collapsed, trapping everything inside under tons of rock. The duplicates started dissolving back into water. The skinwalker screamed, a sound so loud it made the water vibrate. I saw the bubbles holding the real people starting to float upward, being pushed to safety by the rising currents. But Sarah's bubble, it got caught on one of the falling rocks. Before I could swim to her, the whole temple came down between us. I barely made it out. The current from the cave-in pushed me up, and I shot to the surface like a cork from a bottle. When I looked back down, the underwater city was gone, buried under a mountain of rock. The lake turned dark purple for a few days after that, then slowly went back to its normal blue. They found most of the missing people on the shore, confused but alive. They didn't remember anything about being in the water. But Sarah, we never found her. Sometimes on quiet nights, I think I can still hear her voice in the deep rumble of the lake. The official report says she went missing in action. Only I know the truth, she's still down there, somewhere under all those rocks, in the remains of that ancient city. I quit my job as a ranger after that. Couldn't stand looking at the lake anymore, knowing what's down there. Because here's the thing that really keeps me up at night. That lever didn't destroy the skinwalker. It just trapped it again, like it had been trapped before. And sometimes when I see news about Crater Lake, I notice the water level rising, just a little bit each year. And I wonder, are those gates slowly opening again? Will someone else have to make the same choice I did? If you ever visit Crater Lake, and you see someone you know near the water, maybe take a second look. And if their smile seems a bit off, or their movements aren't quite right, just turn around and walk away. Walk away as fast as you can. Because not all the duplicates were destroyed that day. And the lake is still hungry. That was 37 years ago. I'm an old man now, living far away from Oregon and its lakes. But last week, something happened that made all those memories come flooding back. I got a letter in the mail. No return address, just my name written in handwriting I hadn't seen in decades. Sarah's handwriting. Inside was a single photograph and a short note. The photo showed Crater Lake, taken recently. I could tell from the new visitor center in the background. But what made my hands shake was what was in the water near the shore. Faces, dozens of them, just below the surface, looking up at the camera. And right in the middle was Sarah, not aged a day since 1988, smiling that not quite right smile. The note read, "The gates are almost open again, Jack. The water misses you. Won't you come home?" Yesterday, I heard on the news that Crater Lake's water level has risen by 6 feet in just 1 month. Scientists are puzzled, they say. They're blaming climate change, underground springs, anything that makes sense to them. But I know better. I know what's really happening. I'm going back to Crater Lake one last time. I'm too old to dive now, too old to fight. But maybe I can warn people. Maybe I can stop history from repeating itself. If you're reading this, it's my record of what really happened in 1988. And a warning, if you ever visit Crater Lake and see more than one of the same person, or if the water seems to call your name, or if you meet a ranger who moves like they're still underwater, run. Because the skinwalker is patient. It's been waiting all these years. And this time, I don't think a lever will be enough to stop it. This is Jack Morrison, signing off. If you don't hear from me again, well, just stay away from the lake. Some waters are better left undisturbed. My name is Ruth Anderson, and this happened to me back in 1956 when I was just 12 years old. Even now, at the age of 81, my hands shake when I think about that summer in the Wallowa Mountains. Some memories never fade, no matter how much you want them to. We weren't a rich family, far from it. Dad, George, worked as a mechanic, and Mom, Martha, did part-time typing work at the local library. My older brother Eddie was 15, always with his nose in some mystery book, and little Tommy was just 6, the baby of the family. We lived in a small house in Portland, but Dad always dreamed of having an RV to travel around in. That spring, Dad came home excited like a little kid on Christmas morning. He'd found an Airstream trailer for sale at a price so low it seemed too good to be true. "It's a steal," he kept saying while Mom looked worried. I remember her asking, "George, why is it so cheap?" We all went to see it the next day. The seller was this skinny man with twitchy eyes who kept wiping his sweaty forehead. He barely looked at us while Dad checked the trailer, and when Tommy tried to ask him questions, he practically ran away. I remember thinking that was weird, but kids don't really question adult stuff much. The Airstream was beautiful, all silver and shiny on the outside. But inside, something felt off. There were these strange scratches on the walls that Dad said were probably from furniture moving around. Tommy immediately loved it, running from one end to the other, but my stomach felt funny when I stepped inside. You know that feeling when you think someone's watching you? It was like that, only worse. Eddie, being Eddie, started asking the seller questions about the previous owners. The man just mumbled something about them moving away suddenly and practically threw the keys at Dad. He didn't even count the money properly before leaving. That's how it all began. If only we'd known then what those scratches really meant. If only we'd noticed how the seller couldn't wait to get rid of it. If only we'd listened to Mom's gut feeling. But we didn't. And that's why I'm telling this story now, because people need to know what's out there. Sometimes the best deals in life come with the highest prices. And sometimes what looks like a dream come true can turn into your worst nightmare. The first week in our new Airstream was pretty normal. Dad parked it in the Wallowa Mountains campground, saying it would be a perfect summer getaway. The air was fresh, and the pine trees made everything smell wonderful. But then things started getting strange. It began with Tommy's new friend. One morning at breakfast, he was giggling and waving at an empty corner of the trailer. "Who are you waving at, sweetie?" Mom asked, making pancakes on our tiny stove. "Mr. Shadow," Tommy said happily. "He's funny. He makes faces at me." Mom and Dad exchanged worried looks, but they probably thought it was just a normal imaginary friend thing. I knew better. I'd seen how the shadows in the trailer moved differently at night, like they were dancing when they shouldn't. Then came the photos. Eddie had this new camera he'd saved up for, and he was taking pictures of everything. But when we developed them at the drugstore in town, something wasn't right. In every family photo, there was this dark blur. At first, it was just in the background, far away. But in each new picture, it got closer and closer to us. "It's just a problem with the camera," Dad insisted. But Eddie kept all the photos anyway, pinning them up in order on his wall. Looking at them gave me the creeps. The scratches on the walls got worse too. Every morning, there seemed to be new ones, even though Dad kept patching them up. And at night, I'd hear this soft scraping sound, like fingernails on metal. Mom said it was just the wind or tree branches, but there weren't any trees close enough to touch our trailer. The worst part was the dreams. I started having the same one every night. I was standing in front of an old stone altar in the woods, and something was calling my name. Not with a voice, but with thoughts that crept into my head like cold fingers. I'd wake up with my heart pounding, sure that something had been standing over my bed. Eddie noticed it too. He stopped reading his mystery books and started checking out books about local legends from Mom's library instead. "There's something wrong with this trailer, Ruth," he whispered to me one night, "and I'm going to find out what it is." I wanted to tell him to stop looking. Sometimes it's better not to know things. But I couldn't find the words, and anyway, it was already too late. We were all part of it now, whether we wanted to be or not. And Tommy? He just kept talking to his invisible friend. But his giggles didn't sound happy anymore. They sounded scared. It was a Tuesday morning when I disappeared. I remember because we were supposed to have a spelling test at school that day. I was walking the short trail from our trailer to the campground bathroom, something I'd done 100 times before. The morning was foggy, and the air felt heavy, like right before a storm. I heard Tommy's voice behind me, calling my name. When I turned around, I saw him standing there in his red pajamas, but something was wrong. His eyes looked different, darker, empty somehow. That's when everything went black. I woke up 3 days later in a cave I'd never seen before. The walls were covered in those same strange marks from our trailer, but here they looked more like writing. My clothes were dirty, but I wasn't hurt. I just felt different, like something inside me had changed. The whole town had been searching for me. When I stumbled back to the campground, Mom cried for hours, holding me tight. Dad kept asking me questions I couldn't answer. Where had I been? What had happened? The truth was, I didn't know. Or maybe I did, but my mind wouldn't let me remember. But things were definitely different after I came back. I started knowing things I shouldn't know. I could tell when people were lying. I could feel what others were feeling. And sometimes, when I touched things, I saw flashes of things that had happened before. Eddie noticed the change in me right away. He'd been busy while I was gone. One afternoon, he pulled me behind the trailer and showed me what he'd found. He'd been digging around our camping spot and discovered something buried underneath. An old stone altar, just like the one from my dreams. "Look at this," he whispered, showing me his notebook. He'd copied down some of the marks from the trailer walls and found matches in an old book about Native American symbols. "These aren't random scratches, Ruth. They're warnings." That same day, Mom started getting headaches. Bad ones. She'd press her hands against her temples and mutter things none of us could understand. Sometimes she'd stare at Tommy for hours, tears running down her face. "He's changing," she told me one night when we were alone. "My baby's changing, and I can feel it happening. There's something in his head, Ruth. Something that wants in mine too." I wanted to tell her about the cave, about the marks, about everything I could suddenly do. But before I could, Tommy walked in. He smiled at us. But it wasn't Tommy's smile anymore. "Mr. Shadow says it's almost time," he said in a voice that wasn't quite his own. "He says we're all going to be together soon." Mom started crying again, and I felt that familiar coldness creeping into my thoughts. Whatever had taken me to that cave wasn't done with our family yet. Not by a long shot. Dad finally saw it one night. He'd been so busy trying to fix the trailer and keep our family normal that he'd missed all the signs. But that night, when he went to check on Tommy, he saw Mr. Shadow. He told me later that it looked like a massive figure, tall as our ceiling, with long arms and dark fur like a bear, but standing like a person. Its eyes glowed like dying campfire embers. Dad tried to scream, but no sound came out. The creature just put one long finger to where its mouth should be and pointed at Tommy, who was sleeping peacefully. That's when all the pieces started falling together. Eddie's research, my new abilities, Mom's headaches, and Tommy's strange behavior, it all made sense. This thing, whatever it was, had been using our trailer as a trap. All those families before us who disappeared, they hadn't just moved away. "It needs a family," Eddie explained to Dad and me in whispers while Mom was trying to get Tommy to eat something. He'd stopped eating regular food days ago. "The books say it's an ancient spirit that can only survive by bonding with a human family. It takes them one by one, starting with the youngest." Mom could feel it more than any of us now. She and Tommy seemed connected to the creature somehow. They would sit together for hours, staring at nothing, having conversations in their heads that none of us could hear. Sometimes they'd both turn and look at us at exactly the same time with the same empty expression. One night, I woke up to find Eddie shaking me. "We have to do something," he said, his voice shaking. "Look at this." He showed me his camera. In the latest picture, the dark figure wasn't in the background anymore. It was standing right in the middle of our family, its long arms wrapped around Tommy and Mom. Dad had found some old papers stuffed inside the trailer walls. They talked about a ritual that could trap the creature, but it needed a sacrifice, someone to keep it locked away forever. We all knew it had to be done soon. Tommy was almost completely gone, and Mom wasn't far behind. "I won't let it take anyone else," Eddie promised me, hugging me tight. "We're going to fix this." But that night, I heard Tommy's voice outside my window. "Ruth, come see. Mr. Shadow wants to show you something." When I looked out, I saw him standing at the edge of the woods, holding Mom's hand. Behind them was the biggest shadow I'd ever seen. And that's when everything went crazy. Everything happened so fast that night. Dad and Eddie had drawn special symbols all over the trailer, the same ones from the cave walls. They had a plan, but nobody expected Tommy and Mom to move so quickly. I watched in horror as they walked into the woods, following that huge shadow. Dad grabbed his flashlight and ran after them, with Eddie right behind him. I wasn't supposed to follow, but I couldn't just stay in the trailer alone. The creature led us to the stone altar Eddie had found, but now it looked different in the moonlight. Older, scarier. Mom and Tommy stood on one side, their eyes completely black now. The creature towered behind them, its form shifting between solid and shadow. "Let them go!" Dad shouted, but his voice shook. The creature just tilted its head, and suddenly I felt its thoughts in my mind. It showed me visions of all the families before us, how they'd become part of it, how it had lived for hundreds of years this way. Eddie stepped forward, holding an old book he'd found in the library. "Ruth, help Dad draw the circle," he yelled. I knew what to do. We'd practiced it. But as I started drawing symbols in the dirt with a stick, Tommy screamed. Not a normal scream. It was something else, something that made the trees shake. Mom reached for him, but she wasn't really Mom anymore. Her movements were all wrong, like a puppet on strings. Eddie started reading from his book, strange words I didn't understand. The creature roared, a sound that was more in our heads than in our ears. It reached for Tommy, but Eddie jumped between them. "No!" I screamed, but it was too late. The creature's long arms wrapped around Eddie. I saw my brother's brave face one last time as he yelled, "Finish the circle, Ruth! Do it now!" Dad grabbed me, pulling me back as I tried to run to Eddie. Together, we completed the circle of symbols just as Eddie threw his book to us. The creature shrieked, trying to break free, but the symbols began to glow. There was a bright flash, and then silence. The kind of silence that hurts your ears. When I could see again, Mom and Tommy were lying on the ground. Eddie was gone. The creature was nowhere to be seen. But somehow, I knew where it was. The symbols we'd drawn had worked. They'd trapped it inside our trailer, along with a piece of my brother. Mom and Tommy woke up later, but they were different. They couldn't remember anything that had happened. Maybe that was for the best. Dad aged about 10 years that night. He chained up the trailer and covered it with more symbols, making sure the creature could never escape. But that's not the end of the story, because I can still feel it even now, all these years later. That was 69 years ago. I'm an old woman now, with gray hair and wrinkles, but I've never forgotten what happened. More importantly, I've never stopped feeling what's in that trailer. We left the Wallowa Mountains the day after Eddie, after we lost him. Dad sold our house in Portland and moved us far away to California. Tommy grew up with no memory of that summer, and Mom never talked about it. They both lived normal lives, though sometimes I'd catch Mom staring into space, like she was trying to remember something just out of reach. Dad made me promise to keep checking on the trailer. Every year, I'd drive up there alone. The campground closed down long ago, and the area is all overgrown now. But the trailer still sits there, covered in vines and rust. The chains Dad put on it are still strong, and the symbols haven't faded. I can feel it inside, waiting. Sometimes, when I place my hand on the trailer's cold metal wall, I think I feel Eddie too. Not scared or suffering, but standing guard, keeping the creature trapped. My brave big brother, still protecting us after all these years. But something's different now. Last week I felt a change. The trailer's walls are getting weaker, and the symbols aren't glowing as bright when I touch them. I can sense the creature stirring, getting stronger. And worse, I've seen a "for sale" sign on the land where the trailer sits. Yesterday, I saw a young family looking at the property. Mom, Dad, and 3 kids. The youngest boy was playing near the trailer, and I heard him laugh and wave at something inside. My heart nearly stopped when he said, "Look, Mom, there's somebody in there." I have to do something. I can't let another family go through what we did. That's why I'm telling this story now, because the creature is waking up, and it's hungry for a new family. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear Tommy's voice in my dreams, saying those words that changed everything. Mr. Shadow says it's almost time. I'm getting too old for this fight. Soon, someone else will have to take my place as the Watcher. But who? And will they be strong enough to keep the creature trapped? Because one thing I know for sure, if it ever gets out, it won't stop with just one family this time. It's been waiting too long for that. I'm writing this down because I might not have much time left. Yesterday, I drove up to the trailer again, bringing my old photo album, the one with those pictures Eddie took. The real estate agent had put a sold sign over the for sale one. My worst fear was coming true. I parked my car and walked to the trailer, my old legs shaking with each step. The chains were still there, but they looked thinner somehow, like they were wearing away. And the scratching sounds from inside, I hadn't heard those in decades. Taking out Eddie's old notebook, I started checking the symbols. Some had faded so much they were barely visible. As I touched the trailer wall, a flood of images hit me. The new family, their 3 children, and their future, all twisted and dark. The creature was already reaching out to them, sending them dreams about a perfect summer home. That's when I saw him, Eddie. Not as the teenager he was, but as he would have been at my age. He was standing beside the trailer, visible only to me. "It's getting stronger, Ruth," he said softly. "The symbols need new power. You know what that means." I do know. The ritual that trapped the creature needs to be renewed, and it needs another guardian, just like Eddie became one all those years ago. I've lived a long life, and I don't have any family left to protect. Maybe that's why I'm seeing Eddie now. It's my turn to stand guard. But before I do what needs to be done, I had to write this warning. If you ever find an old Airstream trailer in the Wallowa Mountains, with strange marks on its walls and chains around its door, stay away. Don't let your children near it. Don't take pictures of it. And whatever you do, don't try to buy the land it sits on. Because if you do, you might meet Mr. Shadow. And trust me, you don't want that. Some secrets should stay buried, some trailers should stay locked, and some shadows should never be disturbed. Tonight, I'll perform the ritual one last time. Eddie won't be alone in his watch anymore. And maybe, just maybe, we can keep this evil locked away forever. If you're reading this, please share my story. Warn others, because the creature is patient, and it only needs one mistake, one curious child, one desperate family to start its hunt again. And remember, sometimes the best deals in life come with the highest prices. My name is Marcus Reynolds, and this happened to me back in 1977. I still get chills thinking about those nights in the Oregon mountains, but I need to tell this story while I can still remember parts of it. I was 32 then, just another messed up Vietnam vet trying to get my life back together. The nightmares wouldn't let me sleep, you know, the kind that make you wake up screaming and soaked in sweat? Every night, I'd see my buddies from the war, their faces frozen in time, calling out to me. Some nights were so bad, I'd end up sitting on my apartment floor until sunrise, afraid to close my eyes. Then my Uncle Pete died. We weren't super close, but he was the only family I had left. The lawyer called me one morning and said Uncle Pete had left me his old Winnebago, one of those big camping vehicles from 1975, cream-colored with brown stripes down the sides. It wasn't much, but it was home on wheels. I remember thinking maybe this was my chance to get away from everything. My therapist kept saying I needed a change of scene, and well, that old Winnebago seemed like an answer to my prayers. It needed some work. The radio was acting funny, and the heater made weird noises, but it ran okay. So I decided to head up to Mount Jefferson Wilderness. It's this beautiful place in the Oregon Cascades where Uncle Pete used to take me fishing when I was a kid. I thought maybe going somewhere peaceful would help clear my head. Man, if I'd known what was waiting for me up in those mountains. But I guess you need to hear the whole story to understand why I can't remember certain things anymore, and why I break into a cold sweat every time I hear children laughing in the distance. Let me tell you about that first day when I arrived at the campsite, and how everything started going wrong. The drive to Mount Jefferson started out normal enough. It was a clear October morning, and the big Winnebago rumbled along the winding mountain roads like a tired old horse. The radio kept doing this weird thing, switching between stations on its own. At first, I thought it was just bad reception in the mountains. Around noon, I started noticing something odd. Every time I checked my rearview mirror, I'd catch glimpses of what looked like dark shapes moving between the trees. But when I'd turn to look properly, there'd be nothing there. I told myself it was probably just birds or my tired mind playing tricks. The campground was empty when I pulled in, not surprising since it was getting pretty cold up there. I found a nice spot near some tall pine trees and parked the RV. The silence hit me first. You know how sometimes silence can be so complete it feels like it's pressing against your ears? It was that kind of quiet. While setting up camp, I found these strange markings on some rocks nearby. They looked old, carved into the stone, pictures of something that looked like a person with wings, but not like any angel I'd ever seen. The wings were wrong somehow, more like bat wings, and the face. Well, I tried not to look at it too long. That's when I met old Joe. He just appeared out of nowhere, this Native American elder with deep wrinkles and eyes that seemed to look right through you. He was carrying some firewood, said he lived nearby and checked on the campground sometimes. "You shouldn't be here," he told me, his voice dead serious. "Not now. Not when the night flayer is hungry." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and said, "The one who steals more than just life. It feeds on the darkness in men's souls, on their memories. The petroglyphs, those rock carvings you were looking at, they're a warning." I didn't take him seriously then. After Vietnam, I thought I'd seen the worst things possible. Man, was I wrong. As the sun started setting, the temperature dropped fast, way faster than it should have. I went inside the RV and tried to warm up. That's when I heard it. Children laughing. Not just one or two, but what sounded like a whole group of kids playing. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside to check. The campground was completely empty. No cars, no tents, no people. But I could still hear the laughter, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I found it, the elk, or what was left of it. The animal's body was twisted into an unnatural spiral, like some sick piece of art. The snow around it was stained red, and there were marks in the ground I'd never seen any normal animal make. I ran back to the RV and locked the doors. That was just the first night, and things were about to get much, much worse. I couldn't sleep that first night. Every little sound made me jump. Around 3 a.m., the weirdest thing happened. My RV's old radio turned on by itself. Instead of normal music or talk shows, I heard what sounded like old World War II broadcasts. You know, the kind you hear in history documentaries? But this was impossible. These stations shouldn't even exist anymore. The voice on the radio was talking about soldiers in battle, about men crying out for help. It reminded me too much of Vietnam, of things I was trying to forget. I tried turning it off, but it kept coming back on. The voices got louder and more desperate. Then the cold hit. Not your normal mountain cold, this was different. The temperature gauge on my RV showed 20 below zero, which made no sense for October. My breath came out in thick white clouds inside the RV, and frost started forming on the windows. Even with 3 blankets, my teeth wouldn't stop chattering. That's when I saw it for the first time. I was looking out the window at the full moon when this huge shadow passed across it. Wings, massive wings, bigger than any bird I'd ever seen. My heart nearly stopped. I told myself it had to be clouds, but deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I met Billy. He was camping a few spots down, a young guy, maybe mid-20s, also a vet but from a different unit than mine. We got talking about normal stuff at first. The weather, camping, our service time. He seemed like a good kid, kind of reminded me of my younger self. "Something's not right here," Billy told me over coffee. "Last night I kept hearing voices calling my name, voices I haven't heard since Afghanistan." I wanted to tell him about what I'd seen, about old Joe's warning, but I didn't want to scare him. We agreed to check in on each other, just to be safe. That night, I heard Billy screaming. By the time I got to his campsite, he was gone. His tent was shredded from the inside out, like something had burst through it. There were bloody handprints on the ground, leading into the woods before disappearing completely. His flashlight was still on, rolling back and forth on the ground. Inside his torn tent, I found his journal. The last entry made my blood run cold. He'd written, "It's not just watching us, it's learning from us. It gets inside your head, shows you things, takes pieces of you. I can feel it eating away at my memories. If you find this, run. The Night Flayer isn't just a story, it's..." The entry stopped mid-sentence. When I got back to my RV, I saw them, 5 long, deep claw marks carved into the metal roof, like something huge had perched there while I was gone. I knew then that Old Joe was right. We weren't alone in these mountains, and whatever was out there, it wasn't just hunting our bodies, it was hunting something deeper. I spent that whole night huddled in my RV, clutching my old service pistol. Not that I thought it would do much good against whatever was out there. The scratches on my roof kept making creaking sounds as the metal settled, like something was still up there, waiting. Around midnight, the temperature dropped again, and that's when things got really bad. I started seeing them, my old war buddies, the ones who didn't make it back from Vietnam. They were standing outside my RV windows, looking exactly like they did on that last day. Tommy with his lucky baseball cap. Martinez still holding his radio. Wilson with that goofy smile of his. "Come on out, Marcus," they called. "We've been waiting for you." I knew they couldn't be real. I'd seen each of them die. But they looked so real. Their voices were exactly how I remembered them. I could even smell Wilson's cigarettes, the same brand he used to smoke. Then I heard it, a sound I'll never forget, like thousands of whispers all at once, but not in any language I knew. The windows of my RV frosted over completely, and through the ice, I saw it clearly for the first time. It was huge, maybe 9 feet tall, with skin like old tree bark. Its wings spread out wider than my RV, black as midnight. But its face was like looking into a dark mirror. Somehow, it kept changing, showing me faces I knew. My buddies, Billy, even my own face, all twisted together. That's when I understood what Old Joe meant about it stealing memories. Every time it showed me a face, I felt those memories getting fuzzy, like someone was erasing parts of my mind. "Your pain," it whispered in a voice that sounded like dry leaves crushing. "Your memories, they're so delicious." I realized why it had chosen this place, why it went after veterans like Billy and me. We carried so much pain, so many dark memories. We were like an all-you-can-eat buffet for this thing. The creature pressed its face against my RV window, its breath turning the glass black with frost. "Give them to me," it hissed. "Give me all those memories you want to forget. I can take away the pain, Marcus, just like I did for Billy." Part of me wanted to give in, to let it take away all those horrible memories of Vietnam, of watching my friends die. But then I remembered something my old sergeant used to say. Our memories, good and bad, make us who we are. I knew I had to fight, but how do you fight something that feeds on your darkest memories? The answer came to me when I saw my war medals hanging on the RV wall. Those medals represented everything: the pain, the loss, the guilt. If this thing wanted my memories so badly, maybe it was time to give it more than it could handle. I grabbed my medals, Bronze Star, Purple Heart, all of them, and ran outside into the freezing night. A blizzard had started, but the snow wasn't natural. It was black, like ashes falling from the sky. "You want my memories?" I shouted into the darkness. "Come and get them!" The creature swooped down, its wings creating wind so strong it rocked my RV. My war buddies' images flickered around me like broken movies, but this time I didn't look away. Instead, I forced myself to remember everything, every painful moment, every loss, every scream. "Take it all," I yelled, holding up my medals. "But be careful what you wish for." The thing reached for me with its long black claws, but instead of running, I threw my medals right at it. As they touched the creature, something strange happened. My medals started glowing red hot, like they were on fire. And with them came every memory they held. Not just the pain, but the brotherhood, the sacrifice, the love for my fallen friends. The creature screamed, not like any animal I'd ever heard. It was like 1,000 voices screaming at once. It tried to pull away, but it was too late. The memories it had been so eager to steal were too much for it. All that pain, but also all that love and loyalty. It was more than it could handle. The thing burst into black flames, its wings turning to ash. As it burned, I saw faces in the fire. Billy's face, faces of others it had taken over the years. They seemed to be smiling like they were finally free. When it was over, I passed out in the snow. The rangers found me 3 days later, half frozen but alive. They never found any trace of the creature, just some strange burn marks in the snow and 5 deep claw marks on my RV's roof. Billy's body was found 2 years later in an ice cave high up on Mount Jefferson. The strange thing was, he looked peaceful, like he was just sleeping. The rescue team said they'd never seen anything like it. As for me, well, I lost some memories that night. There are blank spots in my mind where certain war memories used to be. Sometimes I can't remember my buddies' faces clearly anymore. But you know what? Maybe that's okay. The nightmares stopped, and the guilt isn't as heavy. I sold the RV and moved to a small town near the coast. Never went camping again. These days, when I hear children laughing or see strange shadows at night, I just turn on all the lights and remind myself that some memories are better left in the past. But sometimes, on cold nights when the wind blows just right, I swear I can hear whispers in the distance. And I know that somewhere up in those mountains, in the deepest part of the wilderness, something is still hungry for memories. So if you're ever camping in the Oregon Cascades and hear children laughing in an empty campground or see strange shadows against the moon, do yourself a favor. Pack up and leave. Some stories aren't meant to have more than one survivor. My name is Dorothy Williams, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me in the summer of 2022. I still get chills thinking about those 7 days in Tillamook State Forest. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, my hand automatically moving to my pregnant belly, wondering if I should even share this story. But people need to know. They need to understand what's out there. It was supposed to be a fun honeymoon trip. 3 couples in a converted school bus RV, exploring the beautiful Oregon forests. My new husband Frank and I had just gotten married 2 months ago, and I was 8 weeks pregnant, though we hadn't told anyone yet. It was our little secret, something that made me smile every morning. Frank was so excited about the trip. He'd spent months converting that old yellow school bus into something amazing. He'd added beds, a small kitchen, and even a tiny bathroom. It wasn't fancy, but it was perfect for our adventure. The other couples were our best friends. Michael and Patricia had been married just a week after us. Patricia was this free-spirited artist who always wore colorful clothes and had the most infectious laugh. Michael was quieter, always carrying his camera around to capture everything. Then there were Richard and Helen, the ones who helped pay for most of the trip. They'd gotten married 3 months before us and were the most organized of our group. I remember the morning we left Portland so clearly. The sun was bright, we were all laughing, taking silly pictures in front of our blue and white RV. Frank kept making dad jokes, and Patricia was dancing around, her long red hair catching the sunlight. None of us knew what was waiting for us in those woods. None of us could have guessed that I would be the only one to make it out. And now, sitting here writing this, feeling my baby move inside me, I sometimes wonder if I truly did escape. Because every time I look in the mirror, every time I feel my baby kick, I remember those glowing red eyes in the forest, and I know that what followed us home isn't finished with us yet. Let me start from the beginning, from that first day when we turned onto that narrow forest road, and everything still seemed perfect. The drive into Tillamook State Forest started out just fine. The trees were tall and green, and sunlight peeped through the branches. Frank was driving, humming along to some old country song on the radio. I was in the passenger seat, watching the forest get thicker and darker as we went deeper. That's when the first weird thing happened. The radio started making strange noises, not just normal static, but sounds that made the hair on my neck stand up. It was like whispers mixed with animal growls. Frank tried changing stations, but it was the same on all of them. Probably just bad reception out here, Michael said from the back, but Patricia had gone quiet, which wasn't like her at all. She was staring out the window, her face pale. Then our phones started acting up. The GPS kept showing us in different places, first saying we were near the coast, then suddenly in the mountains, then somewhere in Canada. Helen, who was always good with technology, couldn't figure it out. "Let's just use the paper map," Richard suggested. But when we pulled it out, our compass went crazy. The needle just kept spinning and spinning. The forest seemed to get darker, even though it was only 2 p.m. The trees looked different too, older, twisted in strange ways. We hadn't seen another car for hours, and the animals. There were no animals. No birds singing, no squirrels running around, just silence. We were supposed to find a campground, but somehow we ended up on this narrow dirt road I didn't remember seeing on any map. That's when we saw it, an old ranger station, half hidden behind overgrown bushes. The windows were dark, and there was something drawn on the door, symbols that looked like they were made with red paint. "We should stop here," Frank said. "It's getting late, and we need to figure out where we are." I wanted to say no. Everything in me was screaming to turn around and leave. But the sun was setting, and we were all tired and confused. So we parked the RV in front of the station. As I stepped out, I felt something cold run down my spine. The air smelled wrong, like wet earth and something else I couldn't name. Patricia grabbed my arm suddenly. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened. At first, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a soft thumping sound, like a heartbeat, coming from somewhere in the forest. That was just the beginning of our nightmare. While the guys checked out the ranger station, I decided to walk around a bit to stretch my legs. The evening was getting colder, and fog was starting to roll in between the trees. That's when I saw something that made my stomach turn. About 50 feet from the station, hidden behind some bushes, I found what looked like an old graveyard. There were stones arranged in a circle with strange markings carved into them. They weren't regular gravestones like you'd see in a cemetery. These were rough and ancient looking. Some had those same red symbols we'd seen on the station door. "Helen," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Come, look at this." Helen came over, her flashlight beam bouncing through the fog. When she saw the stones, she froze. She'd studied Native American history in college, and I could tell by her face that something wasn't right. "These shouldn't be here," she said quietly. This isn't a normal burial ground." That's when we heard Patricia screaming. We ran back to find her standing in the middle of the road, but something was wrong. Her eyes were wide open, but she wasn't really seeing us. She was walking slowly toward the forest, speaking words none of us understood. Michael tried to stop her, but she pushed him away with strength she shouldn't have had. Frank and Richard managed to get her back to the RV, but she wouldn't wake up. She just kept mumbling those strange words. We tried calling for help, but our phones showed no signal. Not even emergency calls would go through. Then we heard it, animals running. Lots of them. Through the RV windows we saw deer, rabbits, even a bear, all running away from the forest like something was chasing them. They didn't even seem to notice us. They just kept running. That night, none of us slept well. The RV felt too small, too exposed. Every noise made us jump. Patricia finally fell quiet around midnight, but she wouldn't remember anything the next morning. I woke up around 3 a.m. to get some water. Through the window, I saw something that still haunts my dreams. 2 red eyes, glowing in the darkness between the trees. They were too high up to be a normal animal, and they were watching our RV. I wanted to wake Frank, but my body wouldn't move. I just stood there, staring back, until those eyes slowly disappeared into the forest. The worst part? I could have sworn I heard it whisper my name. The next morning started badly. Michael went to get firewood for breakfast, a simple 10-minute task. But an hour passed, and he hadn't come back. "I'm going to look for him," Frank said, grabbing his flashlight. Richard went with while Helen and I stayed with Patricia, who was acting strange again. She kept drawing the same symbol over and over in her notebook, a circle with what looked like claw marks through it. The RV started doing weird things too. The lights would turn on and off by themselves. The GPS screen kept showing places that didn't exist, names in a language I couldn't read. Then the radio turned on by itself, playing static mixed with what sounded like people crying. 3 hours later, Frank and Richard came back. Their faces were white, and Frank was holding something in his hands, Michael's jacket. It was torn and dirty, with strange marks on it that looked like giant claw marks. "We found this near a clearing," Frank said quietly. "There were footprints too, but—" He stopped, looking scared. They started as human footprints and then changed into something else, something bigger. Helen started crying, and Patricia suddenly stood up, her eyes looking empty. She walked to the window and pressed her hand against it, leaving a mark that looked exactly like the symbols she'd been drawing. "He's with the Guardian now," she said, in a voice that didn't sound like hers at all. "The Guardian of the Sacred Ground." That's when Richard noticed something under the RV. He bent down and pulled out a small leather bag. Inside were old bones, feathers, and stones with those same red symbols we'd seen everywhere. None of us had put it there. The sun was setting again, and the forest seemed to get darker faster than it should. We could hear something moving in the trees around us, something big. The footsteps got closer and closer. Then Richard started acting weird. His eyes got a red glow, just like the ones I'd seen in the forest. He began speaking in the same strange language as Patricia, but his voice was deeper, angrier. Frank grabbed my arm and whispered, "I know what's happening. I found some old papers in the ranger station. This place, it's sacred ground. The Dogman isn't just a monster, it's a guardian, and we're not supposed to be here." I wanted to run, but where could we go? The forest was all around us, and somewhere out there, Michael was still missing. As night fell, we could hear howling, but it wasn't like any wolf or dog I'd ever heard. It sounded almost human. And that was just the beginning of the longest night of our lives. That night, everything fell apart. We were huddled in the RV, trying to figure out what to do. Richard was getting worse. His eyes kept glowing red, and he started scratching at the walls, leaving deep marks in the metal. Helen tried to calm him down, but he pushed her so hard she hit her head on the table. That's when we knew Richard wasn't Richard anymore. Something else was controlling it. Frank found an old journal in the ranger station and was reading it frantically by flashlight. "It says here there's a way to fix this," he whispered to me. "The natives used to perform a ritual when the Guardian was angry, but—" he looked scared. "It needs a sacrifice." Suddenly, the RV's doors flew open by themselves. Outside, the fog had gotten so thick we could barely see the trees. But we could see those red eyes, dozens of them, watching us from the darkness. The howling got louder, and it sounded like it was coming from everywhere. Patricia started walking toward the door like she was in a trance. "The Guardian calls," she said in that creepy voice. "The sacred ground has been disturbed. Blood must be paid." That's when Helen did something brave and terrible. She grabbed the journal from Frank, ran outside, and started reading the ritual words out loud. The red eyes moved toward her. Richard screamed, a sound that wasn't human at all, and jumped out after her. "Dorothy!" Frank grabbed my shoulders. "The journal says a pure soul must complete the ritual. You're pregnant, you're carrying new life. It has to be you." I was terrified, but I knew he was right. I could feel it somehow, like the forest was calling to me and my unborn baby. Frank handed me the journal with shaking hands. "I'll protect you," he promised. "Just read the words." I stepped outside into the fog. Helen was still reading, with Richard getting closer to her. The red eyes were everywhere now, and I could see shapes moving in the darkness. Tall, wolf-like figures walking on two legs. I started reading the ritual words. They felt strange in my mouth, but somehow I knew how to say them. The ground began to shake. Helen screamed. Richard lunged at her, but Frank jumped between them. Everything was happening so fast. There was blood, screaming, those horrible red eyes getting closer and closer. I could barely see through my tears, but I kept reading the ritual words. The ground shook harder, and a weird red light started coming from the burial stones. Helen fell first. Richard, or whatever was inside him, got to her before Frank could help. I heard her last scream and had to force myself to keep reading. Frank was fighting Richard, trying to keep him away from me while I finished the ritual. "Keep reading," Frank yelled. "Don't stop, no matter what." Patricia was on her knees now, her body shaking like she was having a seizure. The dogman creatures were getting closer. I could smell them now, like wet fur and something rotten. Their red eyes were fixed on me. Then Frank did something I'll never forget. He looked at me one last time, smiled, and said, "I love you both." Then he grabbed Richard and ran straight toward the burial ground. The dogmen followed them, their howls shaking the trees. There was a bright flash of red light. I heard Frank's voice mixing with the howls, and then silence, complete silence. I finished the last words of the ritual. The ground stopped shaking. The fog started clearing. Patricia collapsed, unconscious but breathing. When the sun came up, I couldn't find any bodies. Not Frank's, not Helen's, not Richard's, and not Michael's. The burial ground looked untouched, like nothing had happened. Only the claw marks on our RV proved it wasn't all a nightmare. I managed to drive Patricia to a hospital. They said she had a mental breakdown and kept her for treatment. She's still there in a special facility. Sometimes she draws those symbols on her walls and talks about the guardian, but most days she just stares out the window. I thought it was over. I really did. But 3 months later, during my pregnancy checkup, the nurse looked worried while doing the ultrasound. "That's strange," she said. "For a second, I thought I saw." She shook her head and smiled. "Never mind." But I saw it on the screen. Just for a moment, my baby's eyes opened and glowed red. Last night, I woke up to find those symbols drawn on my bedroom wall. I know I didn't draw them. My due date is getting closer, and sometimes at night, I hear howling in the distance. The guardian isn't finished with us. Maybe it never will be. If you ever go to Tillamook State Forest and you see an old ranger station with red symbols on the door, drive away. Drive away as fast as you can. Some places should be left alone, and some guardians never stop watching. My name is Dr. William Hayes, and what I'm about to tell you happened to me back in 1995. Even now, 30 years later, my hands shake when I think about those 3 weeks in the Rogue River Siskiyou National Forest. Sometimes I look down at where my left arm used to be, and the memories come flooding back like a nightmare that never really ended. I was a wildlife researcher then, young and eager to make my mark in the scientific world. When dead animals started showing up in strange patterns across the forest, my team and I thought we had stumbled upon something fascinating, maybe a new predator behavior, or an unusual natural phenomenon. How wrong we were. Let me introduce you to my team. There was Lisa Chen, our brilliant biologist who could identify any animal just by looking at its tracks. Mike Thompson was our tech guy. Give him a broken radio and he'd have it working in minutes. And Sarah Rodriguez, the best field researcher I've ever known, could spot things in the wilderness that most people would miss. We had this fancy RV as our mobile lab. It was like a small house on wheels, filled with all sorts of scientific equipment. The university had spared no expense, wanting us to get to the bottom of these mysterious animal deaths. We were so excited, thinking this might be our big breakthrough. The first few days were normal enough. We set up camp near the river, where most of the dead animals had been found. But then things started getting weird. We found bones, lots of them. But they weren't scattered like you'd expect. They were arranged in perfect circles and triangles, like someone, or something, had carefully placed them there. At night, we'd hear strange sounds, not like any animal I'd ever heard before. And the locals, well, they tried to warn us. They told us stories about something they called the Bone Weaver. We thought they were just old folk tales. I wish we... Little did I know that this was just the beginning of a horror that would change our lives forever. and some of us wouldn't make it out alive. It all started to get really strange when Lisa had her first seizure. We were out collecting samples near a rocky cliff when she suddenly dropped to her knees. Her eyes rolled back, and she started mumbling words none of us could understand. When she came to, she couldn't remember what had happened, but she kept saying she felt like something was calling her. We should have packed up and left right then, but scientists are curious by nature, and we wanted answers. The next day, while following some weird tracks in the mud, we found a cave entrance. It wasn't on any of our maps. The opening was perfectly round, like something had carved it out. Sarah, our field expert, said she'd never seen anything like it. We should check it out, Mike suggested, already pulling out his flashlights. Inside the cave, our lights showed something that made us all stop breathing for a moment. The walls were covered in paintings, ancient ones. But these weren't like normal cave paintings of buffalo or hunters. These showed something that looked like a skeleton, but it was huge, with too many limbs, all twisted and wrong. The paintings showed it doing something to people and animals, turning them into new, horrible shapes. That night in the RV, none of us could sleep. The wind outside made weird whistling sounds, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Lisa kept getting headaches, and she'd stare out the window for hours, like she was waiting for something. I wrote in my journal, Day 7, something's not right here. The animals we're finding aren't just dead, they're changed. Yesterday we found a deer, but its bones were on the outside of its body. That's not possible. It's just not possible. Then came the full moon night. That's when everything went from strange to terrifying. We were sitting in the RV, going over our findings, when all our equipment went crazy. Every screen, every meter, every device we had started showing impossible readings. And then we heard it, a sound like bones clicking together, coming from just outside our door. I'll never forget what we saw when we looked out the RV window that night. In the moonlight, there it stood, exactly like the cave paintings, but real. It was tall, maybe twice the size of a person, with bones that moved and shifted like they were alive. Its skull had too many eye sockets, all glowing with a pale blue light. Mike grabbed our camera, his hands shaking so bad he could barely hold it. "Nobody's going to believe this," he whispered. But before he could take a picture, the thing moved. It didn't walk. It sort of flowed, like water made of bones. And then it did something that still gives me nightmares. It reached out toward a tree. As it touched the bark, the tree started to change. The wood began twisting and turning into something that looked like flesh and bone. It was like watching a tree turn inside out. Sarah screamed, and that's when it noticed us. We all ran to the back of the RV, but Mike and Sarah were too slow. That thing, it reached through the window. I saw its bony fingers touch them both at once, and then... I can barely write this even now. They started to melt together, their bodies joining like clay being mixed. Their screams, those screams. Lisa collapsed into another seizure, but this time was different. Her eyes opened, and they were glowing with the same blue light as the creatures. "It's trying to fix us," she said in a voice that wasn't quite her own. "It thinks we're wrong. It's trying to make us right." The RV itself started to change around us. The walls became soft and started pulsing like they were breathing. Our computers melted into the tables, turning into something that was half machine, half living tissue. I found some old government files in our database that night, as we huddled in what was left of our vehicle. Files about other research teams that had disappeared in forests around the world. Files about things that had been here long before humans. Things that saw us as mistakes that needed to be corrected. We were trapped. The roads had turned into something like living flesh, impossible to drive on. And outside, that thing was waiting, watching us with its empty eye sockets, deciding how to fix us next. Lisa's connection to it grew stronger every hour. She could feel what it was thinking. But with each passing moment, she was becoming less herself, less human. Things got worse fast. The RV wasn't just changing. It was trying to trap us. The door had turned into something like a mouth, and the walls were closing in slowly. I was trying to reach our emergency radio when it happened. My left arm got stuck in what used to be a normal wall. But now the wall was like quicksand made of flesh, pulling me in deeper. "William!" Lisa shouted. She was the only one left besides me. Her eyes were now more blue than human, and veins of light pulsed under her skin. "I can hear it. I can understand what it wants." I pulled and pulled at my arm, but it was no use. The wall was digesting me, melting my flesh into itself. The pain was unbearable. That's when I saw the axe from our emergency kit, just within reach of my right hand. I still remember Lisa's face when I grabbed that axe. She knew what I had to do. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "One swing. That's all it took. I'll spare you the details, but that's how I lost my arm." As I lay there, trying not to pass out from the pain, Lisa told me everything she'd learned from her connection with the creature. She spoke fast, like she was running out of time. "They're Earth's immune system, William," she said, her voice changing between her own and something ancient. "They've been here for millions of years, fixing what they think is wrong. When life takes a path they don't want, they reshape it. They're everywhere, sleeping under the ground, waiting." Then she did something I'll never forget. She walked to the RV's door, what was left of it. "Lisa, don't!" I yelled. She turned to me, smiling sadly. "Someone has to talk to it. Someone has to make it understand. Maybe that's why I can hear it. Maybe that's what I'm meant to do." Before I could stop her, she opened the door and walked out into the moonlight. The bone creature was waiting. I watched as she walked toward it, her body glowing brighter with each step. What happened next is still hard for me to describe. Lisa reached out and touched the bone creature. There was a flash of blue light so bright it lit up the whole forest. I could hear Lisa's voice in my head, screaming and laughing at the same time. She was talking to it, fighting it, trying to make it understand. The creature's bones started shifting and moving faster and faster. Lisa's body began to change too. Not in a horrible way like Mike and Sarah, but like she was turning into pure light. Then everything around us started changing back. The fleshy road slowly turned back to dirt. The RV's walls became metal again. It was like watching a video in reverse. But Lisa was gone. Where she and the creature had been standing, there was just a circle of normal bones arranged in a perfect spiral. In the middle was a message scratched in the dirt. "Run. I'm holding it back. More will come." I didn't need to be told twice. Despite my missing arm and the pain, I ran. I ran until I found the main road, until I found help. When the government people finally came, they quarantined the whole area. They said it was because of a forest fire, but I knew better. They questioned me for weeks. I told them everything, but I could tell they already knew. They showed me files, pictures of other bone creatures found in other forests, other countries. Some were sleeping, some were waking up. That was 30 years ago. I'm one of the few who knows the truth. Sometimes, when I'm in the woods, I feel like the trees are watching me. Sometimes I think I hear bones clicking together in the dark. And sometimes, on full moon nights, I dream of Lisa. In my dreams, she's still out there, still fighting, still trying to protect us from these ancient guardians who think they're fixing the world by breaking it. The government still keeps that part of the forest closed. They say it's for environmental research, but I know they're watching, waiting. Because Lisa was right, there are more of these things. And one day, they might all wake up. I know this story sounds crazy. Most people wouldn't believe it. But if you're ever in the woods and find bones arranged in patterns, or if you hear something that sounds like clicking bones in the darkness, run. Just run. Because now you know what I know, and some knowledge, once you have it, changes you forever.